I'm your host, Dr. Naomi Dogan, otherwise known as Dr. Nomi. The mission of this program is to promote accurate education and be a prompt for public discourse on topics usually regarded in the mainstream as unspeakable or too challenging to broach. Today, I have with me my friend and colleague, Glenn Koenig, who is the author of the book, A Man Wearing a Dress. Glenn studied gender issues at Goddard College in the 1970s, and I'm delighted to have him here with us today.
Thank you.
Welcome, Glenn.
Thank you.
So, I understand you have a theory about blame, and I wonder if you can explain that a little bit more. I know you've done presentations on blame and shame, and I've had the privilege to see a few of them, and you do a great job.
That's right. I'm doing a workshop, which I'll be doing again this coming January, called Understanding Blame and Shame and How to Work Through Them. And what I do in the workshop comes out of some thinking about this for quite a few years, and also while I was writing the book, as to the sort of mystery as to why in my family in the beginning, people blamed each other for things that then kept occurring over and over again. And it seemed as if the act of blaming somebody didn't ever help. It didn't improve anything. And it seemed really obvious that there was no good in doing it. But there was this urge to do so anyway. And that was a mystery to me. I couldn't figure out why would we feel an urge to blame when, in fact, it didn't seem to help much. So I really stopped and thought about it a lot. And I realized that a lot of the things we do in our life have to do with control. And if we didn't control things, we'd be extremely vulnerable. And this, as an example, if you hold something simple like a cup of water, the cup is an agent of control. It's a tool of control. In other words, if you tried to hold the water in your hands, it would just fall right through. You wouldn't be able to drink any. So the cup is a way of controlling the liquid that you need in order to sustain your life, essentially. If you didn't have water for a couple of days, you'd probably get very ill or pass away. So some of the things that we do in our life, many of the things we do in our life, we take control in order to survive and thrive and prosper. And when we lose control, like when there's a car accident, we use the phrase, they lost control of the car. But there's minor things that happen in life, too, where we lose control, like somebody knocks over a glass of milk on the table or something like that. That control of that liquid is lost, it spills on the floor, and it can't be used again. So that's upsetting. And when things are upsetting, or in the case of the car accident, are incredibly disturbing or hurtful or even cause death, it's natural for us to look for sort of a cause and effect, to figure out the why.
We want to chunk the information.
We want to find out, why did this happen? And that's a natural thing to do because we want to keep this scary thing from continuing to take place. What gets left out of the thought process is that we're all human. We have flaws. We have limitations and drawbacks. I wrote some of them down here on my note about what some of the things are that can get in our way of doing what we think or maintaining control, such as we have emotional issues and emotional history. Maybe we have a lack of time or resources or money or sleep. The car accident could have been caused by somebody who was too sleepy because they didn't get enough sleep. Maybe there's stress in our environment. There could be thousands of reasons why something goes wrong. We don't have the ability to maintain control, and then something happens, which is upsetting to us. So then we get to the question of, well, how does blame actually help in that, or how does it seem to help? And I think the answer is that if we place the blame on somebody, then the rest of us can feel satisfied that control could have been maintained if that person hadn't done something wrong. Which, in my thinking about this, I come to the conclusion that that's not possible. There isn't any way to have perfect control. We can't ever make sure that something bad doesn't happen. There's that sense of vulnerability, that sense of We don't really have control over everything. And that's really frightening to people, I think, that things could go out of control at any moment, and no matter what you've done to prevent it, in spite of our best efforts, bad things can still happen. So, but sort of the act of blaming,
it's a shortcut.
It's a fiction. It's a sort of a Band-Aid on the whole process, because you're saying, well, I'm pretending that I know why this happened and who was responsible and how I can keep it from happening again. The truth is, you don't really know completely why it happened, because you can't understand all the factors inside of a person. There are too many and we're too complicated, number one. And number two, you can't fully anticipate all the factors in any given situation. Life is very complicated. So it's impossible to cover all the bases, to figure out all the possible scenarios where something bad could happen. There's always that option where something goes wrong that we hadn't figured out was going to happen ahead of time. And in that case, blame can't help us. It can't make any difference, really. All it really does is make the person who we're blaming feel bad about themselves and feel like, oh, I'm no good. Maybe there's something evil about me, or I'm a sinner, or I'm flawed, or whatever we might call it. And that doesn't seem to help anything. I mean, I think this is the juncture of where we're coming to in terms of considering something like restorative justice as an example, where we're trying to say, okay, the old days was guilty and not guilty. The new days are, let's look at the complexity of what happened. Let's see if we can resolve some of these things.
Can you explain the term restorative justice for folks that are unfamiliar with that term?
Briefly, restorative justice is a process of taking the person who we see as the cause of a problem or a hurt or something along those lines, and instead of putting them in an adversarial situation where we have these lawyers and those lawyers arguing in front of a judge and somebody makes a black and white decision, we say, okay, how can we do something to restore a sense of balance within the group of people which this happened, within community? And how do you go about doing that? You go about doing that to bring together and bring out into the open the harm that was suffered by the people who suffered some harm, and an acknowledgement by the people who may have caused that harm as to their own role in it, and how what were the complexities of the situation, and why did this happen, and what beyond that can be done to help figure out how to restore that balance. Is there something that somebody did? Is there a way for them to make up for that somehow? Is there a way to not only apologize, but to do something that helps heal the situation that occurred? As impossible as that might seem, in the case somebody might have died or suffered a serious physical harm or whatever, there still is an opportunity to find a path for healing.
And that is in fact what happened in South Africa with the Hutus and the Tutsis when there was killings, and they came together and did restorative justice as a community.
Right, and it involves a whole lot of factors, which are discussion and understanding and apology and forgiveness and an interplay of real people who don't perfectly confine their actions to, prescribed channels of action. I'm not saying that very well, but I think of Nelson Mandela, who was in prison for a long time. And then when he finally got out, he could have done a number of things. He could have taken up a gun and amassed a militia and gone out and tried to kill people who put him in jail. And instead of doing that, he said, I'm going to try and see what I can do to get some healing to happen. And worked very hard at that. So that's the thing I think about blame, and how it's easy to, when something upsets us, to blame somebody and not say for ourselves, oh, part of why I got upset has to do with me, as well as what the other person might have done. Sometimes it's really obvious, if somebody,
They're saying it's a much more complex process.
It's a much more complex process.
To recognize what's happening inside of me and what's happening inside of the other person that led to this circumstance versus just pointing fingers.
Yes. And if somebody said something that was misinterpreted, it gives us us a chance to understand what the intent was and what the misinterpretation was and why that was come across as hurtful and so forth, and maybe kind of untangle it rather than just saying there's a cut and dried reaction, which is, you said that, that's crossing the line, you're out of here.
So
and
this
then,
gets to clear communication.
yeah, and clear communication is difficult. Language is imperfect. Our thought processes are sometimes confused or, have flaws, and it can be difficult.
It seems to me it's also something important about the snap judgment, to blame somebody, versus having to take some time to think about these moving pieces and to
Yes.
recognize the humanity in all of the people involved, and that it looks different from different vantage points.
Yes, and I think the snap judgment comes from a sense of fear. As soon as control is lost and something happens which seems harmful or upsetting, there's an immediate, I think, reaction in most of us, which is, uh-oh, we've lost control. Uh-oh, we're vulnerable. We're in a scary place now because something happened we didn't expect. And we want to gain that control back as quickly as possible. If we can say, oh, it's all that person's fault, we've acted to contain the cause into one person. And so we make ourselves feel safer because it's like, okay, everybody's okay, and that person's the problem. So now we can get rid of them or punish them or lock them up or whatever.
That's
and
called scapegoating.
Yeah, and we've solved the problem. Actually, you haven't solved the problem because that one person wasn't the whole cause of the trouble. There was a whole lot of other factors involved, probably. But it's very tempting. It's very tempting. It's very hard to do this. And what I'm talking about is something I don't necessarily do very well all the time. It's easy for me to think that somebody else caused something and I blame them. Somebody cuts you off in traffic, and you can say things with the windows rolled up you would never say to their face. And I think we've all done that at one time or another. And if you said it to their face, you might cause an incident of road rage. But the initial impact is like, you put me in danger, shame on you.
I think that this can also be something that comes up when people are in a situation that involves sexuality and intimacy, because there isn't always clear communication, and it can be easy
Yes.
to blame one person or the other for not saying something clearly or not reading the signals or the language that the other person's using, and that it's important to unpack that process, because we can say it's really important to give consent, but in reality, it's not always that black and white for people, and we need to teach them to be much more clear in that their body language and their nonverbal body language and their verbal language skills are all giving the same message, which is no.
Right. And what's difficult is that when there's passion around something like sexuality, it's harder to think clearly and use the correct language when we have very strong feelings going on. And that can make it more difficult to have good communication. If you add external circumstances to it, such as drugs or alcohol or whatever, then the ability to communicate clearly is impaired even more.
So drugs, alcohol, as well as sexual arousal.
And so sexual arousal all can get in the way of good communication, because
Right.
your brain doesn't work the same way as it does when those other things aren't going on.
And that's because different parts of our brain are engaged. And so that's
Right.
like one of the things that I think is really important to teach people, especially young people, is to talk about and negotiate in a clear way, what are we contracting to do? And how are we going to say
Before the passion strikes.
before the passion strikes? And that's not something we see in our culture. We see the passion strikes, and then they're swept up in the moment, and then afterwards,
In the movies.
in the movies, they don't check in with their head and their heart and their gut and their sexuality to say, is this a good idea for me right now? What is getting put into action before we're putting it into words when we're not aroused or under the influence of some substance?
Right, and I would say, to hear you say that, I would characterize that a little bit by saying, when you say especially young people, my sense is it's for everyone.
Absolutely.
And to single out young people is a little bit unfair, maybe, because it's easy for a young person to look at examples of adults doing exactly the same poor behavior or bad communication. It's a challenge for all of us, I think. Yes, those of us who are older have a little more experience. Maybe our hormone levels have dropped a little bit, so our sense of passion doesn't work the same way. But in general, that attention to good communication is important throughout your entire life.
And one of the things that I've learned in some of the workshops that we've both participated in is that we practice these skills over and over and over, just like you practice driving on snow in an empty parking lot. So that you're practicing them with people who aren't necessarily your partner. They're just different people in a workshop exercise, so that you're asking for consent and practicing saying yes and no and
That's
being
right.
clear about what's going on, so that when you're actually in the circumstance, you've already got those skills down. Just like an EMT, they practice those skills so much that when their adrenaline is going, they know the routine already because they've done it when they're not in a state of arousal.
And I think when you bring up the example of something like the EMT, the number of hours of practice for something like that is it's just numerous, a huge amount of time. And I think in terms of, we think of sexuality as something that's natural, and that sort of flies in the face of that. It's like, well, everybody knows how to do it, sort of mythology about that.
Depends what it is.
Yeah. And so I think it's easy to shortchange ourselves and to think, well, I don't need very much. I can do this. And the fact of the matter is, maybe not. Maybe you could get into some serious trouble. And so it's hard to convince ourselves, yeah, okay, I'm going to need some practice. I'm going to go enroll in an event or workshop or seminar or something and take the time and step into a space which is maybe uncomfortable for me to address some of these issues, which I feel kind of funny about. And I think of an example from a cuddle party situation that I went to many years ago, where one of the exercises in the preamble to it is to pair up with another person and have one person say, "May I kiss you?" and the other person has to say, "No." And when they introduce that exercise, little ripples of laughter go throughout the room because people are like a little embarrassed about this. And but the exercise is a very good one, because when you say, "May I kiss you?" and the other person says, "No," it's hard to say no necessarily, although it's an obvious exercise to do that. But the idea of saying no means you're risking disappointing somebody. And that person might react in an unexpected way. They might say, "Well, why not?" And then you're on the defensive. And so we get afraid to do that.
Another thing that we have learned in some of these exercises that we've talked about is how to receive a no with grace and humility, and to say, "Thanks for taking care of yourself," which is very different than "How come you won't go along with what I want?" And when we learn that somebody's no, how can you trust their yes if you can't trust their no? Then we learn that
that's very important.
That there's a real freedom and relief in me knowing if I ask you to do something, that I'm going to trust that you're going to own your no. And if I see any wavering or maybe in your body language or the things that you say, then I can either say, reflect it back and say, "Hey, I see that you have some ambivalence. Let's pause and check in with what's going on," so that you're not making a snap decision and I'm not wondering if I pressured you to make a decision because you felt on the spot. And again, this goes back to this idea of blame in terms of that snap judgment, and that we need to learn to sort of recognize, when are we in snap judgment, when are we in quick decision making, and what is the benefit of pausing and taking a few breaths and saying, "Let me think about this," and then responding.
Well, there's actually two things I want to say about that. One is that in addition to that exercise and that training, was one of the other things they told us was, if you really feel yes, say yes. If you feel no, say no. And if you feel maybe, you should probably say no, because you're ability to go back later and say yes is always still there. But if you feel maybe, it might really be a no, and it's better to say no and give yourself that time. The other thing is that the way we often interpret a no is that there's an implied blame, which is, if I say, may I kiss you, and your response was, well, of course not, then there's a sense of blame back on me, which is maybe there was something wrong with my asking, okay? And if you own your no and you say, my answer is no, and it has nothing to do with the fact that you asked me, then I'm in the clear. I feel like, okay, I asked an honest question, I wanted to do something, and you said, no, I don't want to do it, meaning you yourself don't want to do it, then it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with my having asked you. And that helps keep us, that sense of community, still working.
Right. And for me, I don't always read social cues well. That's
Okay.
part of for me.
Part of your syndrome.
Part
okay,
of
yeah.
part of my part of my being neurodiverse.
Right.
And being on the spectrum is I don't always read social cues. And so the more people are very clear and concrete, the more we just sort of reflect back at what I'm hearing you say, then I know I'm on the same page as the other person. And too often, people are taught to hide what they really feel. That's why I always like being around really young children, because they have no problem saying no.
Right.
They know, and dogs also. Everything I need to know about consent, I learned from a dog.
Right.
Because if a dog doesn't want you to touch it, it's going to growl or move away, or
it'll be really obvious.
It's going to be really
and
obvious.
The dog doesn't deal with
and
shame,
they
just act.
Right, and little kids too. And then we lose that because we are trained, or I would say mistrained, to start giving ambivalent messages to ourselves and others.
Right, that's true.
I wonder if there's other things that you didn't get to today that you want to on this
Well, I wanted to
topic.
talk a little bit about shame and where that comes from, and I
Yes.
think I can cover that briefly, which is shame is a feeling of internal pain, in a sense. And I believe that really originates when we're very, very young. And when we're infants, we're completely helpless. And we depend on the environment around us for our very survival. So contact with someone else and love from them, expressions of love, smiles and being touched and held and all that, are extremely strong signs to us that we're going to survive, we're going to be okay, we're going to be well cared for, we're going to be fed and sheltered and held and put, allowed to sleep and so forth. If someone's, and that's sort of a inherent part of being human. We grow up with that. And if someone says something that separates them from you, that says, I'm going to cut off my love from you, I'm not going to care about you anymore, I'm going to isolate you, reject you, abandon you, that's very threatening. Because it taps into that feeling when we're very small that if we are cut off or rejected or abandoned, we could die, literally. It could be fatal if we were not fed and not cared for and not kept from exposure to the elements.
Right, think about Maslow's hierarchy and food,
Right.
shelter, safety.
Those things are very, very important to us. And even later in life, money is a stand-in for this, okay? If someone is about to lose their job and they won't have an income and they don't know how they're going to cover their basic needs of life, to pay the rent, which means keep shelter and stay safe from the elements and buy food and so on, it's the same kind of threat to survival, essentially. Shame is when someone says, I don't like you, or I'm going to sign you with, I'm going to say that you acted with evil intent, or I'm going to do in some way judge you and say you're not a worthy person anymore because of some action you took or some word you said. And therefore, I'm going to, you get kicked out of the group. You're going to be sent off into the jungle and
voted off the island.
Voted off the island, whatever you want to call it, okay? And what that means is you're going to end up in a place where you're vulnerable to some kind of harm or even death by being sent out into the forest where you have no defense. That's the analogy. That's the sort of primitive part that we evolved with in our minds, because it's only recently that we have had all this high-tech environment that we live in versus a simple hut with some people gathering food and so on and surrounded by jungle or woods or whatever that we evolved millions of years to live in. So shame is it's a very serious matter. It's characterized by a feeling of guilt, lack of worth, fear of rejection or abandonment. And the problem that we have, I think, is to bring it back into the realm about sexuality, gender identity, all the things that you want to talk about on this program, is it's really, there's a slippery slope. It's really easy to happen when somebody comes up with an unexpected facet of themselves. Like they go to a parent and say, I don't feel like a boy, I feel like a girl. Or they go to a parent and say, I'm in love with Jimmy, and my name is Mark, and I'm male. Or whatever they do.
That doesn't fit the standard
It doesn't fit
mold.
with the expectations.
One size fits all.
It's a surprise.
Heterosexual relationship.
Right. It's unexpected, and it can be upsetting depending on who the audience is and what they thought was normal or what they thought was going to happen. And there may be, as you say, this snap judgment, this knee-jerk reaction of rejection, of pushing away, of making distance, of saying, well, I don't know how I feel about you as my child anymore. And that can really hurt. That can cause a huge amount of distress inside of somebody. And that's where I think some of these higher suicide rates come from, is we really have a responsibility, I think, and it's hard to exercise it, to say to somebody who comes across to us with unexpected news that might at first be upsetting to us, to reinforce that bond of love, to say, I still care about you, I'm not going to kick you off the island, I want to hear all about it, I want to make sure that you feel safe with your news, and so forth.
I think that also reminds me that when somebody shares a new piece of information with me, I always like to ask them, is this fresh paint? Is it still a new thing to do? It's very different to tell somebody you're gay if you've been doing it for 20 years. It's very different to be coming out
if you just
to
came
people
out,
for the first time, or people that are in your support circle, like your family and your close friends in your community. And certain communities are more accepting, and certain communities, it can threaten your life in certain countries, in certain areas.
Yes,
so,
some parts of the world.
So I always like to know how much risk it feels like the person is taking when they do share it with me, and to recognize not just what they're saying, but what it feels like for each of us to be holding that information.
Yep. So did you, I don't know if you want to say anything about your, we have just about a minute left, your website or other information about you and about, I can talk about for a second about my book.
I'd like you to talk about your book, and
Okay.
I'd also like to invite you back to talk about gender identity and sexuality
Sure.
and sexual orientation and affinity, because those are things that we hear about in the LGBTQAI plus, but it's something that a lot of people haven't been able to unpack.
Right. Well, my book is titled A Man Wearing a Dress. My name is Glenn C. Koenig. And there's a website which has a number of things on it about the book and some other things that I've been doing. It's called Message Rain. So you take the words message and rain and stick them together and put .com after it, and you get to the website. And there's information about the book, and there's also information about my workshops about understanding blame and shame.
Great.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here.